Hey, we're here with Pastor Matt Everhard from Butler, Pennsylvania. He's at a church that is just up the road from where I used to serve, and I had an opportunity to get together with him while we were still living in the same zip code for a little bit. And he's here to tell us a little bit about Edwards in New York, Edwards and his resolutions, kind of revolving around his new book. Matthew, welcome. I'm glad you're able to do this with us.
Well, hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be a part of this project that you're doing. It looks amazing. The trailer looks really good, so I can't wait to catch some of the episodes. I want to say hello to anybody that is in Western Pennsylvania. If I could, let me be so bold as to invite you to come worship with us sometime. Gospel Fellowship PCA. We're a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. So love to have you in person sometime.
Outstanding. Although the official theme for this video series is trying to lower expectations. That's how we get people to enjoy this.
All right,
first
cool.
off, how did you develop your interest in Jonathan Edwards?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I've always liked the dead writers better than the living writers, and it's not that there's anything that isn't thrilling coming out these days, but whenever I walk through a bookstore, my eyes just tend to gravitate towards the old stuff. I've always liked the Calvins and the Spurgeons and those kind of guys. And Jonathan Edwards captured my attention, man, probably more than 10 years ago for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is that one of the living guys that I really did appreciate, John Piper, was constantly talking about Jonathan Edwards. And so I kind of took the Piper gateway into Edwards studies, as many other people have. But to be completely honest, there was, I wouldn't say a personal crisis, but there was an existential issue that I was going through as a pastor at that time. And it was a period of tremendous stress in my life. And as a pastor, I would find myself constantly worried about my home life when I was at work. And when I was at home, I was worried about my work life and just feeling overrun with the stress of ministry and church and all these responsibilities. And not only that, but I was working through my doctoral program at RTS at the time. And when I went to the dissertation seminar, the guy who was running the doctoral program, Steve Childers, he told us that we should pick a topic that not only could capture our attention for 3 or 4 years, but also pick a topic that when you died and somebody did your funeral, that somebody might say, this idea or this person changed his life. And so I was thinking about my own life at that time, and what do I need? And I knew I had love in my life. I've always felt the love of Christ and the love of my wife and my children and my parents and the love for my church. And so just thinking through the fruit of the Spirit, came to joy and realized that with all the stress in my life, I was severely lacking in joy. And Piper told me that Edwards is constantly talking about joy and spiritual happiness. And so that was sort of the original hook that got me interested in doing Edwards studies. And sure enough, the second I began delving into his writings, I started to find themes of joy and happiness everywhere. So that was sort of the initial foray for my study into Jonathan Edwards.
Okay. Stress at home, stress at work. I'm sure no one has any clue what you're talking about, man.
Right, exactly.
Well, you talked about gravitating towards dead writers. You yourself actually are a living writer, and I assume that you would hope someone would pick up one of your texts. The first one I ran into, if I was in the office, I would have the copy of the book to show people, but your doctoral work at Reformed Theological Seminary focused on a theology of joy, and you touched on these themes of happiness and the Trinity. What role do you see happiness, joy, and the Trinity play in Edwards and his thought?
Yeah, so, I mentioned once you start getting into Edwards, you start finding this theme everywhere. Now, the thing about Jonathan Edwards, of course, is that there's so many things that you could delve into across the whole body of his work. He's got 26 volumes of printed, his complete works through Yale, and there's 70 some digitized volumes, which you can get for free on edwards.yale.edu. So you can study practically anything in Jonathan Edwards because he truly is a polymath in the sense of being a theologian, a pastor, a missionary, He contributes as well in philosophy. So with a person as deep and as broad as Edwards, you could pick practically any topic and there would be some material to go into. But I chose happiness, as I mentioned, because I felt like I needed that in my life. But Edwards roots much of his theology in the concept of happiness, which he ultimately pins to his doctrine of the Trinity. So when Edwards describes the doctrine of the Trinity, he doesn't tend to use the creeds and the confessions as many other Reformed writers would. So for instance, if you and I, maybe we're going to give a lecture on the Trinity, we might start with the Nicene Creed or something like this. Or in my tradition, we might point towards what the Westminster Confession of Faith says about the Trinity. But Edwards tends to avoid the use of creeds and confessions, not that he's against those things, but he tends to build his theology upwards from scriptural revelation. And so, one of the things that he does is he talks about the Trinity in joy quite a bit. That one of the ways that we can understand the interrelationship between the three persons of the Trinity is as a father who rejoices in the person of his son, as the Son of God, the Lord Christ, rejoicing in the glory of his Father, and even drawing the Holy Spirit into this dynamic as the living joy or the personal happiness that exists between the Father and the Son. So Edwards roots his theology of joy in the Trinity, but then when we look at his sermons and his preaching, and he has a ton of sermons out there, we notice that how often he uses joy or its opposites, misery and regret, as kind of the hooks to his exhortations. He's constantly preaching to his audience to seek the higher and greater joys, which of course he roots in a relationship with Christ. So it begins Trinitarian, but then he uses it in a number of ways throughout his writings. His personal writings, his sermons, and even many of his treatises tap into this concept in some way.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you mentioning the sermons. I'm currently going through a book on Edwards that treats the Trinity. It will go unnamed because I'm not really all that thrilled with it. And this author only draws from two miscellanies, his essay on the Trinity and his essay on the mind, and doesn't mention any of the sermons, as if these, what I consider behind the scenes treatises, are representative of his thought on the Trinity. But I think Edwards' thought should best be represented in his sermons, where he intentionally presents this to people. And I think you get a little bit of a different look at the Trinity from his sermons that you do from his private writings. But that's just my problem I'm dealing with now. So
yeah, that's one of the controversies within Edwards studies is searching for the real Edwards. Is it primarily to be found in his miscellanies, where he's writing essentially for his own benefit? He's going to, he uses his miscellanies, sometimes copy and pasting entire sections into his other treatises. So is that where the real Edwards is? Or is the real Edwards the one who prepares these works for the display in the public, either through publication or through preaching? So
yeah, in my writing, I'm decidedly the latter, but I might be the minority in that, I'm finding out. But anyways, so recently you've completed a second book. Tell us about that project.
Right. So in this other book, I really delved into his resolutions, which have always captivated me. And, I actually recommend that people who are getting into Edwards studies might even start with the resolutions as one of the first few things that you read, if for no other reason than that they're very short. And you could probably sit down and within 15 to 20 minutes, you could read the resolutions. And now you can call yourself an Edwards scholar because you've already studied one of his important pieces. After that, you might move on to Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, or his sermon, Heaven is a World of Love, or any other number of things. But there's something about the brevity and the punchiness of the resolutions that have captured my attention. The resolutions were written by Jonathan Edwards when he was just 19 years old. And so that's kind of one of the marvels and the wonders of looking at the resolutions, is you have to begin to ask yourself, well, my goodness, this was coming off the pen of a person who's barely 20 years old. In fact, he's a teenager when he starts this. And it does kind of give you a glimpse into his brilliance. I've argued that Edwards is truly a verifiable genius, And one of the ways that you know a true genius is whether or not they contribute into multiple fields of inquiry. And so for Edwards, obviously, as he's a pastor and a very good one, but also a missionary, theologian, and philosopher, you can immediately see this polymathic intelligence that he has, and is really evident already in his resolutions as he describes the kind of life that he wants to live.
Awesome. Yeah. So Edwards began his resolutions while in New York, and that's why we're interviewing you after this episode on New York. And do you have a sense about what sparked this commitment to the resolutions with Edwards? Was it a specific event, or was this just general musings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So one of the things that we have to know about the resolutions is that Edwards did not invent the genre. This was something that had already been done by a number of persons. In fact, you can look at Benjamin Franklin's set of resolutions. He has just around a dozen or so, mostly focusing on virtues of chastity, timeliness, stewardship of his finances, etc. George Washington has over 100 resolutions, which are very interesting. And I don't believe that they're original to Washington. It does appear that some of these were copied from other sets of resolutions, because this was something that noble and dignified people tended to do at the time, is to write themselves a kind of a trajectory for the person that they wanted to be, including not only their private life, but their public life as well. And so when Edwards begins to write these resolutions as a 19-year-old teenager, one of the things that implies is that Edwards sees himself as somebody who's going to be significant. It's almost as though he wills himself into a life of significance. Clearly, he wants to be the kind of person that matters. Now, in one sense, we can say, well, everybody's life is significant. That's true. But Edwards is self-consciously attempting to steer himself in a particular direction. And in many regards, that direction is to follow the path of his father, Timothy Edwards, who is a local pastor, as well as his maternal grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, who is one of the major players in this particular historical context, along with Cotton Mather and others. Edwards is trying to drive into that lane on purpose. And so he writes these resolutions. And if you'll permit me, I'll just carry on for a little bit. Is that all right?
Yeah.
He writes the first 30 or so of them in one sitting. Now, we know that because the original manuscript for the resolutions they're dated to December 18th of 1722. And they're all in the same handwriting and in the same penmanship, in the same pen ink. Now, in those days, you made your own ink. And so a lot of these Edwards scholars, they can actually date some of Edwards' stuff by what ink he's using. And so his original biographers, they noted that the first 30 or so resolutions were all probably written at the exact same time. And then through the rest of the 70 resolutions, he begins to add them one or two at a time, until August 17th of 1723, where he abruptly stops with his 70 resolutions completed. And then there's a bit of a mystery as to why he didn't write any more and why he apparently stopped using them, because the resolutions and his diary have a symbiotic relationship where they're mutually self-referential. In other words, in his diary, he'll record that he writes resolutions, and then in the resolutions, he'll often date it correspondingly to an entry that he's written in his diary. And so, yes, some of these resolutions are written with a particular happening that's going on in his life that prompts the writing of a new resolution. And so we can sort of see this development in his mind as we read the diary in conjunction with the resolutions, as though they were a joint project together.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. I had no idea. I do know Edwards left New York May 1st, 1723, and he took up tutorship in New Haven by the fall. I'm not really sure at exactly what point that happened. I know Yale was without a rector at the time, so I would just assume Edwards got busy. Is that a sufficient explanation, or does it seem like either he came to maybe a conclusion, or do you really feel that they were somehow just abandoned?
Well, there's a couple theories on this, and I'll share what my theory is. One theory is that Edwards wrote 70 resolutions, which is a nice big round number and a biblical number at that. So there could be a sense in which Edwards wrote these 70 and he said, ta-da, there it is. This is the guide track for my life, and I'm going to try to continue to live my life this way. But the problem with that theory is that if you begin to read the diary in conjunction with the resolutions, you'll notice a building frustration that he has with himself. In other words, there are several entries in the diary where he expresses his dismay at his inability to follow his resolutions. Now, it seems like his original plan was that he was going to go back to the resolutions on a weekly or monthly basis, and he was actually going to compare his life to those resolutions and perhaps even track in some sort of a mathematical way how many times he had failed to carry out that particular resolution. And so one of the dynamics we see between these two documents is that the more Edwards fails to carry out his resolutions, the more he goes back to his diary in frustration and tries to fortify this failure, in some cases by throwing up his hands in discouragement. But in other cases, he goes back to the drawing board to write more resolutions. And so this is an era of his life where he's really straining with himself. He's really struggling within his own heart. Not only that, but there's a drop back to this entire context that's important. And that is that Edwards was running into more and more friction with his father, Timothy Edwards, about two things. Well, first of all, Edwards had already tasted life as a pastor out on his own in the New York era when he goes to pastor the fracturing congregation in New York City. He loves it. He builds some great relationships there, and he will often describe the New York era as the spiritual high point of his life. And you can read about that in his personal narrative, which he wrote in 1740. And he wrote that for Aaron Burr Sr. as kind of a personal spiritual biography, a short one though. So he enjoys this, and when he has to go back home, there's this frustration, which we can see, especially in his diary, where now he's got to do his chores again. He's got to obey his parents again. He's got to live under his father's roof, and he'd already experienced some freedom. So we sense this tension because he's saying things like, even in his resolutions, there's one about, I have to keep careful control that I don't roll my eyes around my parents, or that I don't use a tone of voice that is in any way dishonorable to my parents. And so he senses this in himself. It frustrates him, and so he writes resolutions to try to fortify himself.
Yeah, I'll make sure my kids read those by the end of the week.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing too is that there's this drama happening between Edwards and his dad, and you have to read between the lines in the diary to see it. But his father, Timothy, is not entirely sufficient with Edwards's profession of faith. There's a debate as to whether or not Edwards is actually saved going on between him and his dad. And the debate goes back to what was called the Puritan morphology of salvation. And for the Puritans, when they would make a profession of public faith to be able to come to the Lord's Supper to receive communion, they would give their testimony before the church. And Timothy Edwards actually recorded these for his own congregation. So this is an interesting data set of what these testimonies look like. Well, Ken Minkema and others have looked at these testimonies, and they've discerned the set of steps that was expected to go through when you were describing your salvation. And apparently, when Edwards explained his salvation experience to his father, he did not sufficiently describe the stage that we call legal terrors, which is a terror of the law of God. We see this, for instance, like in Pilgrim's Progress, when a Christian is going along the way and he feels that Mount Sinai is going to fall on him and crush him. Well, that's this Puritan idea of legal terrors. And Edwards apparently didn't have that experience. And so his father is sort of questioning his salvation. And so in the diary, if you read through the diary, you'll see that Edwards is beginning to question this entire morphology. And eventually, of course, in some of his major works, such as the Religious Affections, he's going to recast that entire thing instead of in steps, like a chronological sequence of experiences that a person should go through. Edwards is going to reframe it all as the change of the heart within the religious affections.
Yeah.
So that describes some of this tension between him and his parents during the 1722, 1723 year.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating because one of the things that I was impressed on just going through Edwards' sermons and writings for the video series is I don't know why it should be surprising, but to me it was the surprising emphasis on holiness during his time in New York. And in my mind, that actually validates his personal narrative he wrote in the 1740s or in 1740. I know some people criticize Edwards saying, well, no, his personal narrative was more about the values of the Great Awakening in 1740 than it was about his conversion experience closer to 1720. But these details seem to match up pretty well, that in his personal narrative, he says, I was, consumed by this idea of holiness. Mm-hmm. And we have the sermon, The Way of Holiness. His first miscellaneous entry is on holiness.
Yep.
Might you think that Edwards' focus on holiness and even his resolutions might be his own version of legal terror? Maybe not satisfactory to his father, but I mean, it does seem like there's, I'm not trying to justify the morphology of conversion, but I don't know. Do you think that there is a common root there that maybe Timothy was not satisfied with? But
well, when we read the diary, it's kind of like listening to only one side of a phone call. You're listening to a person who's talking on the phone, and we get Edwards's thoughts, but we don't, unfortunately, have what Timothy said about Edwards's profession of faith, other than there's a sense in which it was deficient in some area. It's definitely true what you said, that Edwards is exploring the concepts of holiness. And like you mentioned, that is miscellany A. That's the very first miscellany, is one on holiness, which Edwards will take that paragraph, and as he's going to do many times throughout his career, he's going to cut and paste it and plop it right into that sermon that you mentioned, that very early sermon on holiness. And that becomes kind of one of his mechanisms as a pastor for preparing his thoughts in preparatory form in the miscellanies, and then plugging them into later documents. But he's absolutely concerned for holiness. He's clearly pursuing it. And he does say, though, in his personal narrative, again, 1740, looking back on his early years, that the New York period in particular was a spiritual high point of his life. And I think for many of us who are Christians, I'm personally a Christian myself, we do look back on our early faith, those period of years where we just had come to Christ and experienced salvation by grace through faith. And many of us will look back on those early years and say, that's when my fervency and zeal in the Lord, perhaps in evangelism, was the strongest. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that we're the most mature person. And as Edwards grows through the years, he does admit in the personal narrative that one of the weaknesses in that younger period in the 1720s was that he had too great a dependence on himself. And to tie this back to the resolutions, this is why the resolutions are very helpful and beautiful to study, but they're certainly not a complete theology in any way, because if anything, what we see in the resolutions is one's desire by resolve, literally says that in every single one of them, to do or to be something that, unfortunately, without the grace of the Spirit of God, is impossible. And so I do think that he recognized this. And I do think that it's that tension between grace and law, or between God's help and the aid of the Holy Spirit and one's own personal strivings. It's that tension that led him to eventually abandon the Resolutions project and to stop comparing himself to these standards which he had set for himself at such a young age.
Oh, that's awesome. How well do you think these resolutions hold up today?
Oh, well, look, I think they're awesome. That's why I wrote this book on them. I think in the book, one of my aims is to make a slight course correction for Edwards, so that the reader would not think that you can literally will yourself into being a mature Christian. I try to balance that. And basically what I do in the book is I go through all 70 of the resolutions and I look at some biblical background. So in that sense, it's sort of a devotional project. And then I do tie in his diary as many times as there is an obvious relationship between those two. And then I also fill in some stories. I tell a few stories about Edwards's life, perhaps some of the ways that he did carry out or failed to carry out a particular resolution as he grows in the faith as a pastor, as a writer, excuse me, and as a theologian. So yeah, I think it was a great project. I truly enjoyed it. And I felt my own soul challenged in a number of ways, because I do think that the resolutions are powerful. There's a lot of things that he says that, quite honestly, we need to hear. And they shock us into an awareness of our own soul's condition. And they very often challenge us to see the world in a new way. Maybe we should quote from a couple of them. You think I could quote from a couple?
Yeah. Are there any that are special to you?
Yeah, there's a ton of them. I categorize them in 3 different categories. Just generally speaking, I think there's 3 types of resolutions. The first is what I call the existential resolutions. And those would be ones where Edwards is speaking about, what's the purpose of life? What am I here for? Why am I alive? Most of these existential resolutions point to the glory of God, similar to like Westminster Shorter Catechism number 1, what's the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy him forever. Well, Edwards doesn't quote that, but he says similar things. So resolution number 1, he essentially resolves to live for the glory of God. He says, resolve that I will do whatsoever I think to be the most to God's glory and for my own good, profit, and pleasure, and the whole of my duration without any consideration of the time. So he says, the reason I'm alive is to glorify God. And the second category of resolutions I would call his ethical resolutions. So notice the alliteration here. We have the existential resolutions. The ethical resolutions have to do with duty, honor, living for the sake of the good of others. And then the third category, and this would probably be my favorite, is what I call his eschatological resolutions. And here I'm referring to Edwards's thoughts on death, on heaven, and on hell. And this is a really cool theme, in my view, in the resolutions, because he's constantly reminding himself that he's going to die. He says this in several of them. Think often of the day and the circumstances of my death is one of the resolutions. Yeah. Another one, I'm just going to paraphrase here because I don't have it in front of me. He says, I often hear people of old age say what they would have done if they could live life over again, resolved not to have that sort of regret. That loose paraphrase.
He even writes about that to his teenage daughter, Mary, kind of reminding her, it's likely that you won't live long on this earth.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's an interesting parenting technique there.
Yeah, that's right. There's one, I call this an ethical one, where he resolves not to laugh on the Lord's Day, which that's one where it kind of strikes you as, okay, so no fun on Sundays, no fun.
Yeah.
No NFL on Sundays.
No,
that's for
the
sure.
joy of the Lord is, it's complicated. Which, by the way, your homiletics professor should be very proud of you for your analysis of the resolutions. That was amazing alliteration there.
I worked hard on that. Let me see. Looking at a couple of eschatological ones. Number 17, resolve that I will live so as I shall wish I had done when I come to die. In other words, there's another one of those kind of no regrets type resolutions. 55 is interesting, and this is one that's really provocative in my view. 55 says, resolve to endeavor with my utmost to act as I think I should if I had already seen the happiness of heaven and the terrors of hell. Now, I like that one for a couple of reasons. First of all, you can see there the theme of happiness. And again, I'm still always looking for joy, gladness, happiness, these kinds of things in Edwards' writing. And the point here is like, look, if I could see heaven for even a moment, how would that change the way I live? Well, for one thing, I might more zealously share the gospel. If I see heaven and how glorious it is and the perfections and the beauty of God, that may change the way I worship even here and now. And conversely, if I could see the terrors and hear the screams of hell and smell the sulfur of the brimstone, that might terrify me when I feeling tempted to sin,
Yeah.
or again, it might cause me to share my faith more vociferously.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are a couple of them. They're all awesome. I recommend the viewer just go grab a copy of the resolutions. You
Yeah.
can get it for free online and just read them all.
Yeah, no, I'm still thinking about the don't laugh on the Lord's Day, because that sounds very much like the caricature that's presented of Edwards. But, my initial reaction is, if he had to resolve to not laugh on the Lord's Day, I would say that implies that he would regularly laugh on the Lord's Day. And that does kind of challenge the picture of this, stone-faced Puritan type preacher. So I kind of like that now. I kind of, not that I don't laugh on the Lord's Day, but it gives me a different picture of Edwards, a guy who, if I can put words in his mouth, laughs so much he had to intentionally restrain his frivolity and joy on the Lord's Day. So where can we find this book? I know COVID has kind of thrown a monkey wrench into it, as it has everything, but where can we find it?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, it was supposed to come out October 1st. Apparently, it's been delayed to mid-November. It's stuck in a cargo ship somewhere in a port in California, I'm sure, by this point. But I do believe that you can actually get the Kindle version already. I think the Kindle version is already out. So if you have an e-reader, you can get that. But of course, you can get it anywhere that good books are sold. Amazon is one place. Christian Book Distributors is another. Or you can get it from the publisher itself, which is Hendrickson Publishers, which has recently been acquired by Tyndale House.
Yeah.
So you can probably get it in any one of those places.
Outstanding. So what's your next project? Is there anything cranking yet, or?
Well, don't forget that Miscellaneous Companion Volume 2 is coming out in November. So that's a work on the miscellanies. I do have a short contribution in that book.
I hear a rumor it has an excellent entry on war. That's the.
Oh, is that okay? Yeah, it probably does. Probably very good. Yeah, exactly. I'm working on a book called Souls, Souls. It's a gospel book. It's a presentation of the gospel. I don't know when and how it's going to come out, but something that you can put in the hands of a young Christian to explain how salvation works, or perhaps even share with a person who's not a Christian. Other than that, man, I'm just busy being a local church pastor. This Edward stuff is that's second tier work for me. My real calling is to this church, Gospel Fellowship PCA, and trying to serve the kingdom.
So you do in fact work more than one day a week then?
Yes, and I don't laugh on the Lord's Day either. And that one day that I do work.
I'll say, well, I got one question for you after we sign off the recording, but I appreciate your time that you spent with us, and I'm sure it was helpful to me, so I'm sure it'll be helpful to a lot of people.
Yeah, thanks again. And the title of the book is, I don't even think I said the name of the book. It's called Holy Living, Jonathan Edwards' 70 Resolutions for Living the Christian Life.
I'll say, yeah, that's on me. I'll get better at this thing.
That's all right.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt.